The little girl just whispered it, innocent and blunt. "Daddy, she smells like the hospital." In that quiet cafe, a 6-year-old's observation didn't just break the silence. It shattered a carefully rebuilt life. For the woman with the auburn hair, that scent wasn't just antiseptic. It was the smell of burned skin, of years of agony, and a past she thought was finally hidden. This is the story of what fire takes, what it leaves behind, and the moment a child's honesty forced a survivor to stop hiding. Her name is Alara Vance. 5 years ago, a house fire took her home, her career, and nearly her life, leaving degree burns over 40% of her body. Today, she's mastered the art of invisibility, long sleeves, practiced smiles, a life measured in cautious glances. But beneath that fabric are maps of survival and a story that asks a terrifying question. When the world sees only your scars, how do you remind them and yourself that you're still a person? Before the fire, Alara wasn't just living, she was thriving. At 27, she was a rising architect, her designs featured in magazines, her life a curated collection of sleek angles and open plans. She lived in the renovated brownstone she'd saved for since college. It was her sanctuary, her masterpiece. And on the night of November 12th, it became her cage. The official report would later blame faulty wiring in the original 19th century walls, something no inspection could have caught. Alara was asleep. The first thing she registered wasn't the smell, but the sound, a low, hungry pop inside the wall, followed by the desperate shriek of the smoke alarm. She stumbled into a hallway choked with black, toxic smoke. The heat was a physical wall. The exit was 12 feet away. She never made it. A collapsing beam pinned her leg. The fire, feeding on old wood and varnish, didn't just burn, it consumed. Neighbors heard her screams and called 911. Firefighters found her minutes later, unconscious, her body shielding her face, an instinct that saved her eyes but left her arms, torso, and legs exposed to the flames. What followed was a medical odyssey measured not in days but in agonizing months. She was rushed to the regional burn center, one of only 128 such specialized units in the entire country. The diagnosis was catastrophic: degree, full-thickness burns covering 40% of her body. Her skin was gone. In its place was a charred, necrotic landscape. Here, what most people don't understand about severe burns: the immediate injury is just the opening act. The real trauma is the treatment. To survive, Alara entered a world of calculated brutality. Doctors performed escherotomies, cutting through the burned, leathery tissue to relieve pressure and save her limbs from compartment syndrome. She was placed in a medically induced coma for 3 weeks to endure the unbearable pain. Then came the grafts. They took thin sheets of skin from the few unburned parts of her body, her scalp, her upper thighs, and meshed them, stretching them like lace to cover vast, open wounds. Each graft site became a new wound. The process was repeated over 27 separate surgeries. The goal wasn't beauty. It was simple coverage, survival. The body fights its own salvation. The new skin, the grafted tissue, doesn't grow like normal skin. It contracts. It tightens like a fist, pulling at joints, threatening to freeze her elbows, her knees, her fingers into useless claws. So began the reign of the compression garments. 23 hours a day, she wore custom-made sleeves and bodysuits of thick, beige elastic, a second skin designed to fight her own. The pressure was meant to flatten the scars, but it felt like a constant, suffocating hug. And then there was the pain. Not the sharp pain of the injury, but a nerve pain that never left. A phantom burning, itching, and stabbing that lived in the scar tissue itself, a cruel memory etched into her nerves. Medications blurred the edges but never erased it. The physical torment, however, was only half the battle. The psychological siege began the first time she was lucid enough to look in a mirror. The person staring back was a stranger, a mosaic of shiny red and purple skin, pulled tight in some places, thick and ropey in others. This is the central, horrifying paradox of burn recovery. The medical team fights like hell to save your life, and your first coherent thought is often, for what? Studies show that up to 45% of adult burn survivors like Alara develop post-traumatic stress disorder. The triggers aren't just memories, they're sensations. The smell of smoke, of course, but also the feel of certain fabrics, the sound of a siren in the distance, the specific hue of a sunset that matches the light through her bedroom window that night. Nearly half of all survivors grapple with major depression or anxiety. Your body is no longer your own. It is a public document of your worst moment. Alara's old life evaporated. Her firm, sympathetic but unable to hold her job indefinitely let her go. Friends visited at first, but their faces would pale, their eyes would dart, unable to hold her gaze. Conversations faltered. One by one, they faded away, unable to reconcile the vibrant woman they knew with the scarred survivor in the hospital bed. This social isolation isn't uncommon. It's a documented barrier to reintegration. People don't know what to say, so they say nothing at all. After 5 months in the hospital and a specialized rehab facility, Alara was discharged. She went to live with her older sister, Mara. The brownstone was gone, sold to pay a fraction of the medical debts that soared into the millions. Her world shrank to the size of Mara's spare room. The compression garments became her uniform. Long sleeves in summer, high collars, pants always. She mastered the art of the subtle angle, positioning her body in chairs so her left side, the most severely scarred, was always turned away. She became a ghost in her own life. Grocery delivery after 8 p.m. to avoid crowds. Online therapy sessions. Her only outings were to the burn clinic for ongoing laser treatments to break up scar tissue, a process that felt like being snapped with a rubber band over and over. Her existence was defined by a single, unspoken mission: to pass, to move through the world without causing a stir, without seeing that look asterisk, the double take, the pity, the horror, the curiosity. Her sister Mara was her anchor, but also a living reminder of everything she'd lost. Mara had a normal life, a job, friends, dates. She'd try to include Alara. Just come for coffee, she'd plead. It's a quiet place. For years, Alara refused. The risk was too great. The starring was a physical pain, but Mara was persistent. Which is how, 5 years to the week after the fire, Alara found herself sitting in that warm, golden-lit cafe. It was a test, a tiny, terrifying step. She wore a cream-colored, long-sleeved blouse made of soft linen. She'd practiced her neutral, polite smile in the mirror. She was holding a latte, her hands steady, her breathing controlled. She was doing it. She was invisible. And then the family walked in. A father with 3 identical, beautiful little girls in red dresses. They sat at the next table. The girls were giggling, whispering. Alara kept her eyes on her cup. She was safe. And then the smallest one with wide blue eyes leaned over. She didn't point. She just looked with the pure, unfiltered curiosity of a child. She sniffed the air, and she whispered those 7 words to her father. "Daddy, she smells like the hospital." In an instant, the cafe walls fell away. Alara wasn't sitting in a cozy chair. She was back on the sterile, cold bed of the burn unit, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and silver sulfadiazine cream. The carefully constructed facade of normalcy shattered. The father's eyes met hers, filled with apology and panic. He hushed his daughter, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air, a verdict. Alara stood up, her chair scraping loudly. She didn't run, but she walked fast toward the bathroom, the only refuge. She pushed through the door, leaning against the sink, gripping the cool porcelain. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. The brave half-smile was gone. In its place was raw, unvarnished shame. This was her life now. A life where even a child could see through her, could smell the trauma on her. She pulled back the sleeve of her blouse just an inch. The scar tissue peeked out, a landscape of pink and white. This was the truth she hid. This was what they all saw, even when they pretended not to. A monster, a museum of pain. And that's when she heard a soft knock on the door, not the father. A woman's voice, gentle but firm. It was Mara. "Alara, honey, come out, we need to go." But Alara couldn't move. The world had shrunk to this tiled room. The little girl's voice played on a loop in her head. It was just a child's observation. but it felt like a death sentence, a confirmation that she would never, ever escape. What she didn't know, standing there frozen, was that the father wasn't just apologizing. He was on the phone in the cafe corner, his voice low and urgent. And he wasn't calling his wife. He was calling someone else. Someone who had been looking for a woman matching Alara's description for a very, very long time. The innocent observation hadn't just shattered her disguise. It had just put a hidden, dangerous past on a collision course with her fragile present. The gentle knock turned into the turn of a lock. Mara had gotten the key from the barista. She found her sister leaning against the sink, trembling, her face a mask of shattered composure. "We're leaving," Mara said softly, wrapping an arm around her. "Just to the car, one foot in front of the other." Alara allowed herself to be led, her eyes down, a hot shame flooding her veins. She braced for the stairs as they walked back through the cafe, but the space was oddly still. The family was gone. Their table was empty, cups half full. A $20 bill sat under the sugar jar. It felt like a retreat, and Alara mistook it for pity. What she couldn't see was David Chen's minivan parked just around the corner. He had hustled his daughters out, not from embarrassment, but from a surge of urgent purpose. As he buckled them in, his hands weren't shaking from anxiety. They were steady with focus. He dialed a number from memory. "Sarah, it's David. I need you to pull the file for the Vance fire. November 12th, 5 years ago. The brownstone on Laurel Avenue. I think I just found her." He listened for a moment. "I'm sure." A little girl just pointed right at her hidden history. "Call the team. We have a window." Alara spent the next 48 hours in a self-imposed lockdown at Mara's apartment. The cafe incident confirmed her deepest fear. She was a walking spectacle, an object of curiosity and alarm. She canceled her upcoming laser appointment. She told Mara she was done trying. The world outside was a minefield of innocent cruelty. Better to be a ghost, she decided. Safer. But the world had other plans. On the third morning, the intercom buzzed. Mara answered. "It's for you, Alara," she said, her voice strange. "I'm not expecting anyone. He says his name is David Chen, from the cafe." Alara's blood went cold. He tracked her down. This was worse than a stare, this was a pursuit. Anger, sharp and clean, cut through her shame. "Tell him to leave." Mara spoke into the intercom, then turned back. "He says he's not leaving, and he says he knows about the second fuel source." The words meant nothing to Alara, yet they landed with a strange psychic weight. A second fuel source. She walked to the window, peering through the slats of the blind. The man from the cafe stood on the sidewalk, alone. He wasn't looking up at the window pleadingly. He was looking at the building's facade, at the fire escape, his posture that of a professional assessing a scene. This was no ordinary apology. Against every instinct, she told Mara to let him up. David Chen entered not with the awkwardness of a man who'd witnessed a social disaster, but with the calm intensity of a surgeon. He nodded to Mara, then his eyes found Alara. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He saw her, the tension in her shoulders, the guardedness in her eyes. "Ms. Vance, thank you for seeing me. What my daughter said was unforgivably rude, but it was also correct. You do carry the scent of a long hospital stay. I recognize it. My wife was in the burn unit for 9 months. He let that hang. The admission disarmed Alara's anger, replacing it with confusion. He continued, "I'm not here about my daughter's comment. I'm here about your fire. I was a lieutenant with Ladder Company 7. We were the second due unit on your brownstone." Alara felt the floor tilt. This man had been there, in the smoke, in the chaos. He might have been one of the blurred, helmeted faces she glimpsed before the darkness took her. The air left the room. David opened a worn messenger bag. He didn't pull out photos of the fire. She'd seen enough of those in therapy. He pulled out a sleek tablet. "After my wife's injury, I left the department. I started Phoenix Rising. We advocate for survivors, help navigate insurance, provide peer support. It's my life's work." He tapped the screen, pulling up a file. "About 3 years ago, we started tracking a pattern. Certain fires, certain severe burns were following a specific financial trail. Insurance payouts were being delayed or denied on technicalities. Properties were being bought for pennies on the dollar by the same shell corporation within months of being cleared. It was subtle. It looked like bad luck. He turned the tablet toward her. On it was a schematic she recognized, her own architectural plans for the brownstone's renovation. Your fire was officially deemed an accident. Faulty pre-war knob and tube wiring. Case closed. He zoomed in on a section of the basement. But our forensic accountant, Sarah, the one I called from the cafe, she found anomalies. The insurance policy on your home was increased significantly 6 months before the fire. Not by you. Ilara shook her head. That's impossible. I owned it outright. The insurance was through my firm's group plan. Exactly, David said, his voice low. Your architecture firm, Sterling and Crane, held the policy. And when the claim was paid after the fire, the money didn't just go to rebuilding. The firm dissolved the payout into a labyrinth of holding accounts. You were compensated personally, yes, but at a fraction of the value. The bulk of the money vanished. And the land your brownstone stood on, sold 18 months later to a developer called Tiber Holdings, a subsidiary of Sterling and Crane's parent company. The pieces hovered in the air, not yet connecting. Ilara's mind, trained in structure and design, recoiled at the implication. You're saying my firm burned my house down for a land deal? That's insane. I was their rising star. Were you? David asked, not unkindly. He swiped to another document, an internal memo. The date was 2 weeks before her fire. The subject line streamlining for the Kincaid merger. Her eyes scanned the text. It discussed redundancies and legacy liabilities. Her name was on a list. Next to it, a handwritten note in a familiar scrawl, the managing partner, Arthur Penhaligon. It read, Vance's personal projects are a distraction. Her brownstone renovation is a money pit. A liability. They were going to fire me, Ilara whispered. Worse, David said. They were going to leverage your personal debt from the renovation against you. The merger was all that mattered. You were a passionate architect who cared about historic preservation. They were becoming a corporate machine that cared about square footage and profit margins. You didn't fit. He took a breath. The official report noted one anomaly. The fire's intensity in the basement was disproportionate to the supposed source. The investigator suggested maybe you had stored paint thinners or cleaning supplies down there. You told them you hadn't. I hadn't, Ilara said, her voice thin. I know. Our fire science consultant re-examined the debris analysis. He found trace evidence of a chemical accelerant, one that burns hot, fast, and leaves very little residue unless you're looking for it. It's called triacetone triperoxide, and it's not something that just appears in a home. It's manufactured. It's the second fuel source. Someone helped that faulty wire along, Ilara. Someone made sure the fire wouldn't just smolder. It would rage. It would be unsurvivable. The horror was no longer an abstract paranoid fear. It crystallized into a cold, sharp point. Her home, her body, her life, it wasn't taken by random tragedy. It was taken, deliberately. The nightmares of flames had a face, and it was the face of the men she'd trusted, whose coffee she'd fetched, whose visions she'd helped build. She sank onto the couch, her scar tissue pulling tight with the movement. Why are you telling me this? The case is closed. It's been 5 years. Because patterns need a witness to break them, David said, sitting across from her. Because Tiber Holdings is about to break ground on a new luxury residential complex on your old land. The centerpiece is being heralded as a masterpiece of modern design. The lead architect, he swiped once more. A press release appeared. The smiling, unscarred face of Arthur Penhaligon looked back at her. Him. He's using the prestige of the land, the tragedy of the fire, as a marketing tool. And he's going to get away with it, unless you stop him. Ilara laughed, a hollow, broken sound. Look at me. I can't even go to a cafe. How am I supposed to stop a powerful man with a development company? David leaned forward. You don't have to walk into a courtroom tomorrow, but you have something he doesn't. You have the truth. And you have the original certified architectural plans, the ones he's basing his masterpiece on, our derivatives. We believe he's infringing on your intellectual property. If we can prove that, We can force an injunction, stop the groundbreaking, and open a discovery process that would let us subpoena his financials, his communications from that period. We can use a civil suit to crack open the criminal case. It was an absurd, daunting mountain of a plan. Alara wanted to refuse, to bury her head back in the pillows of her isolation. But a new sensation was stirring beneath the terror, a hot, slow-burning coal of anger. She had spent 5 years believing her body was a monument to an accident. Now she knew it was a crime scene. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "First, you meet my team. You hear the full evidence. Then you decide if you're willing to let a lawyer we trust, a woman named Isabella Ruiz, file the copyright infringement suit on your behalf. You'll be the plaintiff. Your name will be on public record. It will draw attention. His lawyers will come after you hard. They'll try to discredit you, to use your trauma against you." Alara looked at Mara, who gave a slow, firm nod. She looked at her own hands, at the subtle sheen of grafted skin on her knuckles. These hands had drawn the plans for her home. These hands had been burned in its destruction. They were the evidence. "I'll meet your team," she said. The Phoenix Rising office was nothing like the sterile corporate spaces of Sterling and Crane. It was in a renovated warehouse, filled with light, plants, and the quiet hum of purpose. David's team was small. Sarah, the fierce forensic accountant with glasses perched on her head. Leo, the retired fire science investigator with hands that still bore old burns. And Isabella Ruiz, the lawyer who had the steady gaze of someone who had fought Goliaths before. For 2 hours, they walked Alara through the labyrinth. The financial trails, the chemical analysis, the property records. It was a clockwork mechanism of greed. Arthur Penhaligon had been over-leveraged, desperate for the Kincaid merger to go through. Her principled objections to some of the firm's cost-cutting, environmentally damaging designs had made her a problem. Her beautiful, historic brownstone was an asset he could liquidate to cover his debts, but only if she was no longer in it. The fire was the solution. "He didn't pull the trigger," Leo said, his voice gravelly. "He paid someone to do it, a pro. That's why it was so clean. They expected you to die, Alara. The payout was calculated on a death benefit." The words should have leveled her. Instead, they forged something inside her, a resolve as hard as titanium. Isabella laid out the legal strategy. The infringement case was their crowbar. "We file. He'll likely countersue for defamation or nuisance, trying to bury you in legal fees. We have a litigation fund to cover that. Our goal is to get to discovery. Once we have his emails, his bank records from that period, we hand everything to the district attorney's cold case unit. This becomes their problem." Alara signed the retainer. As Isabella packed up her files, she paused. "There's one more thing, Alara. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Laurel Heights complex is in 1 week. It's a major press event. Arthur will be there, giving speeches, taking credit. The optics are terrible for us if we file quietly the day before. It looks like a nuisance suit from a bitter former employee." David finished the thought. "We need to change the narrative. We need to own the story before he does." He looked at Alara, his expression solemn. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, but the most powerful thing you could do is be there. Let the world see you. Let them see the woman whose life and work he tried to erase, standing in the shadow of his new building." The idea was monstrous. To stand in a crowd, under the gaze of cameras, reporters, and the man who had ordered her death. Her scars felt like they were burning anew. The instinct to hide was a scream in her bones. But then she thought of the little girl's voice. She smells like the hospital. She had spent 5 years running from that truth. What if, instead of hiding the evidence, she presented it, not as a victim, but as a witness? What if the scars were not something to conceal, but the ultimate proof of the crime? "I'll do it," she heard herself say. "I'll be there." The week was a whirlwind of preparation that had nothing to do with lawyers and everything to do with psyche. Alara worked with a therapist David recommended, one specializing in trauma and court preparation. They practiced grounding techniques, breathing through panic, scripting short, powerful statements. "You are not asking for pity," the therapist said. "You are presenting facts. Your body is one of them." Mara helped her choose an outfit, not the camouflaging blouse, but a simple, elegant black dress with a V-neck. It showed the scarring at her collarbones and the beginning of the landscape on her chest. It was honest. It was terrifying. The morning of the groundbreaking dawned gray and cold. As Alara stood before the mirror, applying minimal makeup, her hands trembled. She looked at the reflection of the dress, at the visible map of her suffering. For the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a survivor. She saw evidence. David drove her. They parked a block away from the fenced-off site where a temporary stage was set up, flanked by banners boasting Laurel Heights, rising from history. There was a crowd of about 100, investors, press, curious onlookers. They could see Arthur Penhaligon on the stage, looking polished and proud, holding a golden shovel. "You don't have to go up there," David said quietly. "Just being here is a victory." Alara shook her head. "No, he needs to see me. He needs to know his ghost is here." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of damp earth and diesel in the air. She opened the car door. She walked toward the crowd, David a step behind her. She felt the stares immediately, a ripple of confusion, then recognition. Whispers spread. Cameras turned from the stage to her. She kept her eyes forward on Arthur. She saw the moment he spotted her. His smile froze. His eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of cold fury. He leaned over and whispered sharply to an aide beside him. Alara stopped at the edge of the press pen. She didn't push forward. She simply stood there, a silent, stark contrast to the celebratory banners. The reporters, sensing the story, swarmed toward her. Microphones were thrust forward. "Ms. Vance, are you here to protest the development? Do you have a comment on Laurel Heights?" Arthur, recovering his poise, spoke loudly into his microphone, trying to reclaim the event. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's focus on the future we're building today." A reporter shouted Alara's question over the din. "Ms. Vance, this is the site of your former home. What are your feelings seeing this project break ground?" Alara looked past the reporter directly at Arthur. She reached into her purse and pulled out a single, rolled document. She didn't unroll it. She simply held it up. Her voice, when it came, was clear and carried on the cold air. "My feelings are documented in the lawsuit I filed this morning with the federal court," she said. "This project is built on stolen intellectual property, and it is built on a crime." The crowd erupted. Arthur's face turned purple. "That is a defamatory lie," he boomed. Alara took one step closer into the space between the crowd and the stage. She met his gaze and held it. "You know it's not a lie, Arthur. You've known for 5 years." Then she did the thing she had practiced in therapy, the thing that felt both impossible and inevitable. She turned slightly, facing the bank of cameras. With her free hand, she gently touched the scarred skin at her collarbone. "This is what your future cost me. This is the real foundation of Laurel Heights." The flashbulbs exploded. Arthur stood speechless, the golden shovel hanging limp at his side. The narrative of his triumphant groundbreaking was shattered, replaced in an instant by the image of the scarred woman and the developer's guilty rage. David moved to her side, a protective presence. As he guided her back through the narcotic crowd, Alara felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in half a decade. It wasn't happiness. It was power, the power of truth. But as they reached the car, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. A text message flashed on the screen, just 5 words. "You shouldn't have done that." The text was just the first move. Arthur Penhaligon's retaliation was not a lawsuit. It was a character assassination campaign, launched before Alara even got home. By the time David's car pulled up to Mara's apartment, the first news alerts were buzzing on their phones. "DISFIGURED architect accuses developer of arson," screamed one tabloid site. Another, more insidious headline read, "Trauma or Truth." "Burn victims, mental state QSTIONED, in bizarre public accusation." Isabella Ruiz called as they walked in the door. He's moving fast. His PR firm is seeding the narrative that you're unstable, that your trauma has manifested as paranoid delusions. They're reminding everyone you were hospitalized for months, that you've been in therapy. They're weaponizing your recovery. Alara felt the familiar walls of shame trying to close in. This was what she'd feared, being seen, being judged, being dismissed. But the coal of anger was hotter now. "They can call me crazy," she said, her voice steady. "They can't explain away the chemical report." "They're going to try," Isabella warned. "They've already filed a motion to dismiss our infringement suit, calling it frivolous and accusing us of bad faith. The judge will hear it in 72 hours. We need to be airtight." The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was a process server. Arthur was countersuing for defamation, seeking $20 million in damages. The papers claimed her statements were verifiably false and motivated by malice and psychological instability. The legal siege had begun. But the intimidation wasn't confined to paper. That evening, Mara's apartment building had a fire alarm, a malicious pull that emptied the building at 2 a.m. into the freezing night. As residents milled about, Alara saw a man across the street just sitting in a dark sedan, watching. He didn't look away when she saw him. He smiled. It was a clear message: "We know where you live. We can make you feel the heat anytime." David moved Alara and Mara to a safe house, a borrowed apartment owned by a retired firefighter. It felt like a retreat, a regression into hiding, but Alara refused to be cowed. With Isabella, she worked through the night, preparing her affidavit for the court hearing. She wrote not as a victim, but as an architect and a material witness. She detailed the discrepancies in the plans, the financial anomalies. She stated, coolly and clearly, that her physical scars were consistent with a fire accelerated by a chemical agent, not a simple electrical fault. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed with press. Arthur sat at the defense table with 3 expensive lawyers looking arrogantly bored. Alara, wearing a high-necked blazer, sat beside Isabella. She could feel the stares, the cameras. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, took the bench. Arthur's lead attorney, a silver-haired shark named Caldwell, argued first. He was smooth, patronizing. He painted Alara as a tragic figure, her mind broken by unbearable trauma, who had latched onto a wealthy former employer as the focus of her distress. He cited her long psychiatric history, her seclusion. "This isn't a lawsuit, Your Honor. It's a cry for help, a sad, manipulated cry." When Isabella stood, she was all quiet, ferocious precision. She didn't talk about trauma. She talked about copyright law, about derivative works, about the undeniable similarities between the Laurel Heights plans and Alara's original, registered designs. She submitted the forensic accountant's report as evidence of a financial motive. Then, she approached the bench with a single document. "Your Honor, we submit this supplemental affidavit from Mr. Leo Brennan, retired, 20-year veteran of the City Fire Marshal's Office. He has re-examined the official fire debris analysis from the Vance fire. His conclusion, based on chromatographic spectrometry, is that trace markers of triacetone triperoxide are present. This is an accelerant. This was arson." A murmur swept the courtroom. Arthur's smirk vanished. Caldwell was on his feet. "Objection. This is a blatant attempt to introduce sensational, unproven criminal allegations into a civil copyright matter." The judge fixed Caldwell with a steely gaze. "Your client is the one who made the plaintiff's mental state an issue, counsel." He opened the door. "The motion to dismiss is denied. The copyright infringement case will proceed. And given the serious nature of the allegations in this new affidavit, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's cold case unit for review. Court is adjourned." It was a victory, a huge one. As they walked out of the courtroom, Isabella was buzzing. "We're in. Discovery starts next week. We can subpoena everything, his emails, his bank records, his phone logs from that period." But in the hallway, Caldwell approached, his polite mask back in place. "A word, Ms. Ruiz, in private." He drew her aside, speaking low enough that Alara could only catch fragments. "Spare your client further embarrassment. Very generous settlement offer. Medical bills paid in full. A quiet, comfortable life." Isabella's reply was clear and loud. "My client isn't for sale, Mr. Caldwell. She's for justice." Caldwell's eyes turned cold. He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper meant for Alara to hear this time. "You have no idea who you're really fighting, Ms. Vance. This isn't about one building. Walk away, while you still can." The threat was palpable. On the drive back to the safe house, the mood was tense. David broke the silence. "He's scared. The DA's involvement changes everything. But this isn't about one building. What does that mean?" They needed to understand the bigger picture. Sarah, the forensic accountant, doubled down. Working from the safe house, she began mapping every property transaction connected to Arthur Penhaligon and his shell companies over the last decade. The pattern that emerged was chilling. It wasn't just Alara's brownstone. There were 4 other properties, all historic buildings, all purchased by Sterling and Crane or its subsidiaries, all suffering catastrophic, accidental fires within 2 years of purchase. All were now luxury developments, and all the fires had resulted in a casualty, a tenant, a night watchman, a homeowner. All deaths ruled accidental. "He's not just an arsonist," Sarah said, her face pale. "He's a serial killer, and he's been using fire as a demolition and murder tool for a decade." The room went ice cold. The scale of the evil was incomprehensible. Alara's fire wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a business model. Her survival was a flaw in his system. Then Leo, the fire investigator, pointed at the map. "See this? The second fire, the warehouse on the docks. The victim was a homeless man. The report said he was a squatter smoking in the wrong place. But look at the fire department response time that night. It was delayed. Dispatch logs show the call was misrouted. That's not an accident. That's inside help." David's face hardened. Someone on the inside, in the city, maybe in the fire department itself, or the building department. Someone who could ensure investigations stayed shallow, who could misroute trucks. The conspiracy had just grown tentacles into the city's infrastructure. The sense of safety evaporated completely. If they had people in the system, they could be listening, watching, anticipating every move. The next blow came from an unexpected direction. Isabella's office called. The district attorney's office had officially declined to open an investigation. The reason? Insufficient new evidence. The old fire marshal's report stood. Leo's analysis, from a retired investigator working for a nonprofit, was dismissed as non-credible. "Arthur got to them," David growled. "He's insulated. The civil suit is all we have left." But the civil suit was now a deadly gamble. Discovery would force Arthur to show his hand, but it would also expose all of Alara's evidence to his lawyers. It was a race to see who would crack first. The first discovery deposition was scheduled. Arthur Penhaligon himself. It was to be held in Isabella's conference room, under oath. It was their best chance to confront him directly, to trip him up. The night before the deposition, Alara couldn't sleep. The phantom burning in her scars was intense, a constant, painful reminder. She got up to get water. As she passed the living room, she saw David awake, staring at his laptop, a deep frown on his face. "What is it?" she asked. He turned the screen. It was an internal city directory from 5 years ago. He had circled a name in the buildings department. "I've been cross-referencing every city employee involved in signing off on Arthur's projects or the fire investigations," he said. "This guy, Michael Ryder, he approved the demolition permit for your brownstone site with record speed. He also signed off on the fire marshal's final report. He retired 6 months later with a sudden, unexplained disability. He now lives in Belize." "So he was on the take," Alara said. "Maybe, but look at his employment history before the buildings department." David pulled up another record. For 8 years, Michael Ryder was a procurement administrator for the regional hospital network, including the burn center. Ilara's blood ran cold. The burn center, the place that had saved her life. What are you saying? I'm saying the threads are connecting in a way I don't like, David said, his voice grim. We always wondered how Arthur was so sure you wouldn't survive. What if he didn't just start the fire? What if he also tried to finish the job in the hospital? The idea was monstrous, unthinkable. The hospital was a sanctuary, but David's research was relentless. He dug into the burn center's records from that period. He found anomalies. A shipment of specialized antibiotic ointment for Ilara's ward that was mysteriously contaminated and recalled, but only after several patients developed infections. A malfunction in the air filtration system in the intensive care unit that coincided with a spike in pneumonia cases. And then he found the photograph, buried in a staff appreciation newsletter from the burn center, dated during Ilara's 3rd month there. It showed a group of hospital administrators on a fundraising tour, and standing in the back, shaking hands with the hospital's chief of staff, was Arthur Penhaligon. The caption read, "Thank you to our generous donor from Sterling and Crane Architects for his continued support of our life-saving work." Arthur had been inside her hospital. He had donated money. He had access. Ilara felt the room spin. The memories of those months were a haze of pain and drugs, but a specific, terrifying detail surfaced. During a particularly bad infection, a new doctor had insisted on changing her medication regimen to a stronger experimental antibiotic. Her primary surgeon had argued against it, concerned about toxicity. There was a tense discussion at her bedside. She remembered the new doctor's face, his cold, clinical demeanor. He wasn't her regular doctor. Where had he come from? "He wasn't just trying to kill me in the fire," Ilara whispered, the horror dawning. "He was trying to kill me in my hospital bed. He had a backup plan." David nodded, his jaw tight. This is what Caldwell meant. It's not about one building. It's about an empire built on murder. And you are the one victim who lived to tell the tale. You are the thread that can unravel everything. The weight of it was crushing. She was no longer fighting for justice for herself. She was fighting for the other victims, the ones who didn't make it out of their burning buildings, the ones who might not have made it out of their hospital beds. The morning of the deposition arrived. The conference room felt like a war room. Arthur arrived with Caldwell and 2 other lawyers. He didn't look at Ilara. He sat, adjusted his cufflinks, and gave a condescending smile to the court reporter. Isabella began with standard questions about his business, his role at Sterling and Crane. Arthur was polished, evasive, hiding behind corporate jargon. Then Isabella shifted. "Mr. Penhaligon, are you familiar with triacetone triperoxide?" Arthur's eye twitched. "I am not a chemist." "It's an accelerant. Were you aware that trace amounts were found in the debris of the Vance brownstone fire?" "Objection," Caldwell droned. "Calls for speculation. The official report found no such thing." "I'll rephrase," Isabella said smoothly. "Did you, or anyone acting on your behalf, ever procure or request the procurement of any chemical accelerants?" "Absolutely not." Isabella placed the hospital newsletter photo on the table. "Do you recognize this photograph?" Arthur glanced at it. "A charity event. I support many hospitals." "This is the burn center where Ms. Vance was treated for 5 months. Did you visit her during her treatment?" "I did not. That would be inappropriate." "But you were there, at the hospital, while she was fighting for her life. Did you speak to any of her doctors?" Arthur's patience was thinning. "I may have spoken to administrators about the general needs of the unit. As a donor." Isabella let the silence hang. Then she asked her most dangerous question. "Mr. Penhaligon, in the last 10 years, 4 other historic properties in your portfolio have been destroyed by fire prior to redevelopment. Did you find that to be an unfortunate coincidence?" Caldwell was on his feet. "Objection, relevance and foundation. This is a fishing expedition of the most outrageous kind. But Arthur held up a hand. He looked at Isabella, then finally, his gaze slid to Alara. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a low, controlled snarl. I find it tragic, a terrible waste. Some people just aren't strong enough to hold on to what they have. They let things slip away, sometimes through carelessness, sometimes through weakness. The threat was barely veiled. He was talking about the fires. He was talking about her. Isabella didn't flinch. No further questions for now. As Arthur stood to leave, he paused beside Alara's chair. He didn't look at her. He spoke to the air in front of him. You should have died in that fire. It would have been cleaner for everyone. Then he walked out. The deposition was over. They had rattled him, but they hadn't broken him. He was too protected, too entrenched. And now he had shown his true face, a sociopath who saw human life as an inconvenient obstacle to profit. Back at the safe house, the team was exhausted, the air thick with frustration. The legal path was a slow grind, and Arthur had just demonstrated he was willing to wait them out, to bankrupt them, to intimidate them into silence. Alara stood by the window, looking out at the city that contained Arthur's gleaming towers built on ashes. She thought of the other victims, nameless and forgotten. She thought of the little girl in the cafe whose innocent nose had started this avalanche of truth. David joined her. We'll find another way. We'll go to the state attorney general. We'll go to the federal investigators. He'll have answers for them too, Alara said softly. Then she turned, a new resolve crystallizing in her eyes. We've been trying to prove what he did. What if we make him show us instead? We need to stop fighting him on his terms with lawyers and documents. We need to fight him on mine, with the one thing he can't buy, can't intimidate, and can't hide from, the truth told in front of the whole world. David frowned. What does that mean? It means, Alara said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips, I'm done giving depositions. It's time for a different kind of testimony. Alara's plan was not a press conference or a protest. It was an architectural intervention. She called it the evidence room. And she would build it not in a gallery, but on the one piece of ground Arthur Penhaligon could not control, the empty lot right next to his Laurel Heights construction site. It was a derelict parcel, owned by the city and slated for a future park. David used his fire department connections to secure a temporary public art permit. The concept was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Using the language Arthur understood best, design and space, Alara would physically reconstruct the evidence against him for anyone to walk through. She worked for 72 hours straight, fueled by a quiet, focused fury. With David's team and a crew of volunteer construction workers, many of them burned survivors or their families, they erected a long, low, transparent structure made of scaffold and heavy-duty plastic sheeting. Inside, they built a series of stations, like a forensic museum. At the first station, they hung the original, beautiful architectural renderings of her brownstone. At the second, they displayed the derivative, soulless plans for Laurel Heights, with red lines drawn to highlight the stolen design elements. The third station was a timeline, using city records and financial documents, showing the property's journey from her ownership to Arthur's shell companies. The fourth station was the most visceral. With Leo's help, they recreated a small section of a fire forensics lab. They had diagrams of the chemical structure of triacetone triperoxide. They had photographs of the debris, with arrows pointing to the areas where traces were found. And in the center, under a glass case, was a single, powerful object, the twisted, melted remains of her old front door handle, recovered from the salvage yard. The final station was a mirror, a full-length mirror with a simple placard that read, "The Casualty." It forced every visitor to see themselves reflected against the story, to confront the human cost. On the morning of the opening, they sent a press release to every major outlet, not as a legal filing, but as an invitation to an experience. Witness the evidence that the courts won't see. Arthur's response was immediate and violent. 2 hours before the scheduled opening, a crew of men in generic work shirts arrived with a city work order claiming the structure was unsafe and violated code. They began to dismantle it. David and his crew stood in their way. A tense standoff ensued, filmed by the first arriving news crews. David called his contacts in the building's department live on camera. The work order was a forgery. The men retreated, their faces hidden. The incident, broadcast live, only fueled the public's curiosity. By noon, a crowd had gathered, not just press, but ordinary citizens, architecture students, families. Alara stood at the entrance. She wore the same black dress from the groundbreaking. She didn't speak. She simply nodded to David, who cut a simple ribbon. People filed in. The silence inside the transparent structure was profound. They studied the documents. They looked at the chemical diagrams. They stared at the burned door handle. And then they stood before the mirror. Many cried. Some took pictures. All of them understood. Across the fence, the Laurel Heights site was silent. No construction noise. Arthur's office had ordered a work stoppage, not wanting the contrast of his profit-driven machinery next to this haunting memorial. The local news coverage was sympathetic, but the national and international architecture and design press picked it up next. The evidence room went viral not as a true crime story, but as a staggering piece of protest art. It was covered in design magazines, on news networks, in social justice forums. The narrative completely flipped. Alara was no longer the unstable victim. She was the courageous artist-architect using her medium to fight back. The pressure became a tsunami. City council members, previously silent, called for a renewed investigation. The state's attorney general, facing a public outcry, announced she was launching a probe into potential fraud and corruption in city building permits and fire investigations. But the most critical visitor arrived on the third day, an older man in a worn leather jacket who spent over an hour in the exhibit. He introduced himself to Alara as Frank Walsh. He was the brother of the homeless man who had died in the Docklands warehouse fire. He had seen the story and recognized the pattern. "My brother wasn't a smoker," he said, his voice choked. "He was afraid of fire. He'd never have been smoking in there." He handed Alara a folded, stained piece of paper. It was a note his brother had once written, mentioning he'd seen suits visiting the warehouse at night, long after it was supposedly empty. Frank Walsh became the second plaintiff in the civil suit. Then a third came forward, the daughter of a night watchman killed in another of Arthur's fires. The case was no longer about copyright infringement. It was a consolidated civil suit alleging wrongful death, fraud, and racketeering. With public pressure and new plaintiffs, the judge in the civil case granted Isabella's motion for expedited discovery. Arthur was ordered to produce all financial records, emails, and phone logs from the last decade within 2 weeks. This was the breaking point. Arthur could fight one woman he'd labeled as crazy. He couldn't fight multiple families, the press, the attorney general, and a judge forcing him to open his books. He didn't produce the documents. Instead, his lawyers filed for a delay, then another. Then they stopped returning Isabella's calls. Rumors swirled that Arthur was liquidating assets. 1 week later, at 4 in the morning, Alara's phone rang. It was David. "He's running." Private jet filed a flight plan from the executive airport to a country with no extradition treaty. "He's leaving in 3 hours." Alara felt a cold dread. If he got away, it was over. The systems had moved too slowly. "Can we stop him?" "The AG's office is working on it, but they don't have an arrest warrant yet. The civil judge can't issue one." David's voice was tight with frustration. "He's going to walk." Alara looked out the window of the safe house, towards the city. She thought of the mirror in the evidence room. She had reflected the truth for the world. Now, she had to be the reflection Arthur couldn't escape. "Get me to the airport," she said. David argued, but she was immovable. They drove in silence. At the executive terminal, they saw the sleek private jet on the tarmac, its stairs down. A black town car was idling nearby. As they watched from the public viewing area, Arthur Penhaligon emerged from the terminal, flanked by two bodyguards heading for the car. Without a word, Alara got out of David's vehicle. She walked toward the chain-link fence that separated the public area from the tarmac. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She simply stood there in the glare of the tarmac lights facing him. Arthur saw her. He froze mid-stride. Even from a distance, she could see the shock on his face. She was the ghost he couldn't outrun. He pointed at her, barking an order to his bodyguards. They moved toward the fence, but security personnel from the airport intervened, stopping them at the boundary. Alara remained still. She raised her hand not in a wave but with her palm facing him, a gesture of halt, a gesture of witness. For a long minute, they stared at each other across the concrete and chain link, the architect in her black dress, her scars visible under the lights, and the developer in his flee-the-country cashmere coat. The image was captured by a long-lens photographer from the newspaper who had been tipped off by David. The photo would later win awards. In it, Alara looked like an avenging angel. Arthur looked like a cornered animal. He turned away, ducking into the town car. It sped toward the waiting jet. But as it reached the stairs, three unmarked sedans with flashing lights peeled onto the tarmac, cutting off the plane's path. The Attorney General had gotten her warrant. Arthur Penhaligon was arrested on the tarmac, charged with multiple counts of arson, fraud, conspiracy, and manslaughter. The evidence from the evidence room, combined with the financial records the AG had finally subpoenaed, formed the core of the case. The trial lasted 6 months. Alara testified for 3 days. She spoke not just about her fire, but about the patterns, the other victims. She spoke about the scent of the hospital, the feeling of the grafts, the meaning of her scars. She was calm, clear, and devastating. The defense's attempts to paint her as delusional collapsed under the weight of the forensic and financial evidence and the testimony of the other families. Arthur Penhaligon was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, the civil suit was settled for a sum so large it was sealed by the court. Alara used her portion to do 2 things. First, she paid off the medical debts of every patient currently in the regional burn center and established an endowment for their long-term care. Second, she bought the derelict lot where the evidence room had stood. She commissioned a permanent memorial garden for the victims of Arthur's fires, with a small, beautiful pavilion at its center that housed the original exhibit, now a permanent educational tool. David's nonprofit, Phoenix Rising, saw its funding and influence soar. He hired more staff, including peer support specialists who were survivors themselves. And Alara, she went back to school, not for architecture but for forensic fire science. She wanted to learn the language of the crime that had reshaped her, to help others read the stories in the ashes. 1 year after the trial, she was invited to speak at a national conference on burn survivor advocacy. The event was held in a large, anonymous hotel ballroom. As she stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of survivors, medical professionals, and families, she felt a profound peace. She told her story, not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint for resistance. After her speech, as she mingled in the crowd, a woman approached her, holding the hand of a young boy about 8 years old. The boy had scarring on his neck and hands. The woman's eyes were brimming with tears. "My son," she said. "He was in a house fire 2 years ago. He hasn't spoken since. Not a word, but when we saw the picture of you at the airport in the paper, he pointed. And he said, she's like me." It was the first thing he'd said since the fire. Alara knelt down, meeting the boy at eye level. She didn't offer pity, she offered a smile. "You're right," she said. "I am like you, and you know what? We're pretty tough." The boy stared at her for a long moment, then gave a small, shy nod. As Alara stood, she caught sight of her own reflection in a darkened window at the back of the ballroom. She saw a woman in a stylish suit, her auburn hair down, her posture confident. The scars at her neck and hands were visible. She didn't try to hide them. They were part of the design now. They were the proof that she had survived, that she had fought, and that she had rebuilt something more beautiful and enduring than any building, a life of purpose. She had walked into a cafe 5 years after the fire, hoping to be invisible. Now she stood in a room full of people, seen completely, and she was finally free. So what is the real lesson of Alara Vance's story? Is it that we should be careful what we say in front of children? Or is it something deeper, about the space between what we notice and what we truly see? The little girl in the cafe noticed a scent. She had no context, no filter, no social fear. Her observation was a neutral fact. It was the adults in the room, her father, Alara herself, who loaded that fact with meaning, with shame, with history. The child saw a surface truth. It took a community of people willing to look deeper to uncover the monumental, hidden reality beneath it. Alara's journey forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own perceptions. How many times have we seen someone with visible scars, with a limp, with any mark of difference, and made a silent, subconscious story about them? We might feel pity or curiosity or even discomfort, and then we look away. We tell ourselves we're being polite, but in that moment we are reducing a human being to a single chapter of their life, and often we are getting that chapter completely wrong. Her story isn't just about surviving a fire. It's about surviving the aftermath, the well-meaning glances that feel like judgments, the isolation that feels like a prison, the internal voice that starts to believe the world's shallow narrative. Up to 45% of severe burn survivors grapple with PTSD. Their battle isn't just with healed skin, it's with a mind forever imprinted with trauma, and a society that often doesn't know how to acknowledge them without othering them. But here's the transformative flip side. When Alara stopped trying to hide her scars, when she presented them not as wounds but as evidence, she reclaimed their meaning. She transformed them from symbols of victimhood into badges of witness, of resilience, of justice served. In doing so, she didn't just heal herself. She became a beacon for others trapped in the silent aftermath of their own tragedies. David Chen's role is crucial here. He moved from being a first responder who fights fires to an advocate who fights the systems that allow them to be set. He used his skills not to extract a victim from a burning building, but to help a survivor rebuild her life on her own terms. Their partnership shows that recovery is never a solo mission. It requires allies who listen, who investigate, who stand as a buffer against a world that can be cruel in its indifference. The legacy they built is tangible. Phoenix Rising now helps hundreds of survivors navigate insurance labyrinths and find peer support. The Memorial Garden stands where the evidence room once did, a permanent space for reflection. And Arthur Penhaligon's empire of ash has been replaced by something far more solid, a precedent. A warning to those who think greed can be hidden behind flame and bureaucracy, and a promise to survivors that their stories matter, that their lives are not liabilities to be burned away. Alara's story ultimately reframes the very idea of strength. For years, she thought strength was bearing the pain in silence, in invisibility. She learned that true strength is in the vulnerability of being seen. It is in the courage to say, "This happened to me, and I am still here, and I will use my voice, my mind, and yes, even my scars, to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." So the next time you are out in the world, and you see someone who bears the visible marks of a battle you know nothing about, pause. Before you look away, consider the possibility that you are not looking at a victim, but at a survivor. You might be looking at a warrior. You might even be looking at a hero whose story hasn't yet been told. We all carry scars. Some are just easier to see than others. The question is, what do we choose to do with them? Do we let them define us as broken, or do we let them testify to what we have overcome? If this story of resilience and justice moved you, please show your support. Like this video to help others find it. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength. And subscribe to this channel for more documentaries that dive deep into the human stories behind the headlines. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most profound stories are often written not in ink, but in scars.